The material never goes away. You have unmetered and unlimited access to everything that we have published and that we will publish in the future. You can revisit the study, basically download the book version from the website at any point in the future. Let's take advantage of the fact that we're all in the same room at the same time and focus on which of the practices we'll discuss today would have enough traction to be implemented within Victoria. Okay, so our definition of success is not theoretical or academic. It's rather operational. Okay, we only use these 3 hours properly if by the time we shake hands around noon, essentially, some of the things that we discussed have prompted you to do things differently when you go back to your teams, when you go back to your offices this afternoon. To deal briefly with the logistical aspects of the morning, we're going to have a mid-morning break. I'm going to try to remind myself that everybody here has a bladder, all right? And we need to pay attention to those. And we're going to have different levels of emphasis throughout the morning. Basically, Marie has been extremely helpful reviewing the material, basically, and accepting multiple emails with questions from me. Basically, we have figured out that there's a number of best practices within the study that are more closely linked to the situation you encounter in Victoria right now. So we're going to look at the first chapter of the study in detail, one best practice from chapter 2, also in depth of detail, and one practice from chapter 3. The other ones will give a higher level overview. Questions, comments, sarcastic remarks so far? I have never presented to a group of shy Australians. I sincerely hope you're not the first. And for those of you who are joining us remotely, I'm assuming that there's a mechanism in the interface that allows you to basically raise your hand or let us know that you have questions or comments. Don't let the geographical distance basically dissuade you from being equally participative.
Do we need to explain that then to people?
Did they just hear that then?
Yeah.
They can type in a message.
Okay, wonderful. So let me essentially start by introducing the topic. What do you think the 14 stands for?
Minutes? Seconds?
No. It has to do with too much to do in too little time, but it's not that. Essentially, it's not the reference to the number of lines in a sonnet either. Just so you know, 14 is essentially the number of simultaneously ongoing patient flow practices that our average member, and we work with 5,000 hospitals in 52 countries last time I checked, right? But on average, if we look at the center of the distribution, that center of the distribution hospital has 14 simultaneously ongoing patient flow improvement initiatives. Okay? That in and of itself is problematic. If somebody were to tell you that they have 14 priorities, they're actually telling you that they have none. Nobody can process 14 things at the same time in that regard. Now, we looked at what those 14 initiatives typically were, and they could be classified into a number of categories. Some hospitals were working on things that we have known for decades. Estimated date of discharge, for example, right? Extremely powerful practice, yields great benefits. The results tend to be uneven, right? Because there's a significant softer human factor involved in the implementation. Getting the practice going in pilot mode at the beginning, reasonably easy, okay? Getting the practice to stick, preventing frontline teams from reversing to their old muscle memory, to old habits, way more difficult, way more complicated in that regard. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we had hospitals that were giving artificial intelligence and machine learning, automation of many patient flow processes, basically a good old try. You have to mature through the less sophisticated alternatives long before you can graduate to that level, right? So there's huge variety within these 14. We run an analysis as for the prevalence, the statistical frequency of their appearance and their ROI or impact. You can look at the results basically in the book version of the study when you download it off of the website. But essentially, we have a bit of a problem that subsists, and the problem usually pops up when we look at the issue of implementation. So what we did essentially is there's a companion piece that comes together with this study that is, again, fully accessible to you, that looks at the implementation details for each one of the patient flow practices that we have presented in previous studies up until this point in time. And the most powerful and usually implemented upon patient flow practices have to do with discharge management. Discharge is not the only problem that you encounter. However, somewhat counterintuitively is the problem that you need to solve first. There's a very strong temptation when you want to solve problems in tackling those chronologically. Let's fix my admission processes, because admission is the first thing that happens. As much as your intuition pushes you in that direction, we're asking you to fight back against that sort of thing. And again, you'll see why in a few minutes. If your discharge processes are suboptimal, essentially, you are forcing your entire healthcare operation to slow down until they match the low speed of those discharge processes, right? So if you still encounter parts of your healthcare network where estimated date of discharge is not being done for 80% of patients hospitalized, basically, that's the first thing that we'd encourage you to tackle, so to speak. We are looking at essentially this. I'm not.
Just allow that.
Okay, let me see. Oh, it's actually asking me to connect you to the. Okay, let's try that.
Oh.
So we think essentially that you can get much better at the old established best practices, and that will buy you time. It will give you oxygen and credibility in the eyes of the decision makers that need to authorize the business cases and provide the funding. We think that the nature of the problem has changed. That's why we wrote yet another study on patient flow in 2018, when we have been researching that topic every 2 out of 3 years ever since 2008, if memory serves, basically. And the nature of the problem has changed, as you can see in slide, because it's not just an increasing volume of patients that present to your hospitals. It's an increasing degree of complexity for each one of those patients that do present, right? If you had an explosion in the number of category 3 and 4 triage patients presenting in your EDs, well, basically it would have to do with the fact that you have no alternative sites of care where those patients can go. But if you have a lot of 2s and 3s presenting to the ED and failing to meet basically the NEAT target. By the way, your NEAT target has been replicated all over the world. When I go to Ontario or to the UK, and it's like, oh, we can't get patients out of the ED in 4 hours. It's like, it's the Australians' fault. Go talk to them. That's the way I always cover myself. But essentially, the complexity inherent in each individual patient that presents to the ED and therefore takes longer to decide that issue prompts us to believe, to state, essentially, that the nature of the problem has shifted or changed in that regard. At this point in time, we see the vast majority of our members running essentially 2 hospitals within the same site. This is the healthcare or the professional equivalent of schizophrenia. Look at the indicators on the right-hand side of this slide. Essentially, look at the number of same-day discharges that you see, right? And look at the indicators, contrast the right-hand side against the left-hand side of the slide, right? You have a subgroup of patients, a few DRGs, for whom you have a highly standardized process in place. And those patients don't spend a single extra minute with you because the standardization of the process allows you to identify and to serve their needs as quickly as possible, right? Surgical patients are the best example of this, right? If you look at the left-hand side of the slide, on the other hand, basically, you notice that every time the patient is past a certain age, every time the patient presents a given number of multimorbidities, comorbidities in that regard, every time the patient presents not just with clinical, but with psychosocial issues, essentially, the machine grinds down almost to a halt. Right? So within the same site, within the same 4 walls, you're running a fast hospital and a slow hospital simultaneously. That's going to break down every single process you might have in place. And essentially, if you give up on the idea of linking discharge to the efficiency of the process, you encounter yourselves across the top of the slide, essentially. This is a diagram that we first put together in 2012 when we wrote the discharge strategy guide, essentially. What we saw in the vast majority of our members was that hospitals saw discharge predominantly as an admin process. And hospitals are staffed mostly by clinicians. How many clinicians do you know who chose to become doctors or nurses because they love admin? It's like, I really, really enjoy Excel spreadsheets and filling form, therefore I shall become a nurse. Said no one ever in the history of mankind, right? So the clinicians that were in charge of caring for those patients would do everything necessary to get that patient clinically ready to leave the hospital. And only when the patient was healthy, they would say, oh my gosh, we have to arrange transportation for that patient. We have to contact the payer, to make sure they authorize post-discharge care, and so on and so forth. And that would give you the unnecessary length of stay that you see essentially on the right-hand side at the top of the slide, right? Every single best practice that we profiled in that study in 2012 came from hospitals that grabbed the right portion of that top diagram, essentially, and moved it back to the left. And they made discharge management and clinical care of patients one and the same thing. Discharge management was intrinsically linked to the care provision processes, and it started at the moment of admission. Actually, for surgical patients, you can start planning their discharge days or weeks before they get admitted, if it's a scheduled surgery in that regard. And that gave results and continues to give results. We have members in 2019 replicating those 2012 practices and decreasing their length of stay. But the change in the nature of the problem that I showed you in the preceding slide means that if we continue to think of the back door, the exit door, discharge, as the only valve that we have to release tension, we are in trouble already. Incremental gains, yeah, perfect. They're going to give us the oxygen in the time that we mentioned before. We need to start looking at the entry door, essentially, at the front door as often as possible, essentially. We need to start looking for points of departure for patients that don't require a hospital bed at all. Think of a highway to discharge, essentially. How many exit ramps are you going to identify before admission? How many exit ramps are you going to identify that allow for some of that length of stay not to happen in the hospital, essentially? And that's the nature, essentially, of this study. Now, intuitively, this makes sense. We haven't found a single hospital executive worldwide that disagrees on principle with this sort of thing. Implementing it is a completely different matter, far more complex in that regard. And we think the two greatest obstacles to implementation are particularly represented in this slide. On the left-hand side of the slide, there isn't a single actor in healthcare that has 360 degrees worth of visibility of the problem. More often than not, when we ask people about patient flow data, they are experts about the patient flow data that pertains to their silo. Oh, I know exactly what happens in my ICU. I know exactly what happens in internal medicine, essentially. But beyond that, when the patient gets transferred from unit to unit, or when patients basically come from primary care into acute and have to leave for subacute, basically the silos stop the flow of information. We have seen organizations that use different metrics, different terminologies, basically patients that get lost in the handovers and the transfers. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, a problem that has to do with the fact that more often than not, the parts of healthcare systems that initiate solutions to the problems are on the acute side of the spectrum, right? So if most of the people that have the budget, the wherewithal, and the critical mass and power to solve these problems are hospital-based, the fact that they operate within a hospital environment is in and of itself a hindrance, right? Let's try a quick exercise. Quick, whatever you do next, do not think about elephants. Okay, what is everybody thinking of right now? Okay, the same thing happens basically. The elephants in healthcare are acute care beds, essentially, right? We tend to define who we are and what we do, particularly for hospital-based executives, by looking at how many acute care beds we have, essentially. We actually ran an exercise. We had 25 hospital CEOs in our Washington, D.C. office about 2 years ago, and we gave them each a blank piece of paper and a pen, and we said, we want you to write, essentially, the differentiators of your hospital. What sets your hospital apart? What would be the core message of your marketing strategy if you had to compete against the other 24 hospitals in the room? Every last one of the pieces of paper that we gathered back from that group included 2 elements: commitment to patient safety and care quality, and the number of beds, right? So 2 things, basically. If everybody wrote the same thing, how much of a differentiator was it? Not at all, essentially. Everybody defined themselves in the second terms. And secondly, basically, if you have acute care beds in the front of your mind, those acute care beds are going to be a significant part of the solution for every strategy you draft. They're going to push you in the wrong direction. We have to change the default. Instead of when in doubt, admit, we have to think of when in doubt, discharge directly from the ED. When in doubt, find an alternative location of care that is not the hospital before the admission, and so on and so forth. And that informs the table of contents for our study. As you can see, we have organized it in 3 columns, 3 chapters in that regard. The first one has to do with 360 degrees worth of visibility information. This is probably the most IT-heavy portion of the study. And again, both you here in Victoria and New South Wales are going through a painful process of reckoning that your IT interfaces don't give you the degree of granularity and information that you need to guide your decisions, to translate huge amounts of data into limited, manageable amounts of insight, which is what you actually need. Column number 2, probably the most aggressively named chapter in the study, basically pull patients out of acute beds. How do we make sure that a patient occupies an acute care bed only when that is a high-value minute, a high-value hour, a high-value day of hospitalization? That patients are not just lying there waiting for something or nothing, which is sometimes the case to happen. And then column number 3, the last chapter of the study on the right-hand side of the slide, essentially, how do you make sure that we don't default to admissions? That we think of situations where we can do something that is better for the patient, not just better for us as providers, as the system, but also better for the patients than an inpatient bed. And we've identified 2 essentially sub-patient populations: mental health patients and patients over the age of 65 or 70, elderly patients, as populations for whom a hospitalization through the traditional journey is actually detrimental in terms of the consequences of their care. So essentially, this is the agenda for the rest of our morning. Let me pause now, because I've been the only one talking, essentially. Anything that you expected to see that you haven't so far, anything that surprises you by virtue of being there, anything counterintuitive or atypical? And it's not a rhetorical question, just so you know.
From my perspective, I think what I've seen there is sort of tallies a lot with what we've been working for. I think one of the challenges always is this sort of siloed, even within this department, we have very siloed systems of how our programs work. That's probably replicated is throughout our hospitals. So the real challenge is how these ideas, these initiatives become part of just general practice, and not just seen as the piece of work that somebody else they can do over there, but there's no sort of link. So you have to have everybody on the same page, which is, I think, the real challenge here. So surgeons who will think about community-based services that avoid them coming into hospital. There might be other perverse incentives for them to come into hospital. That might be, that they require the income or things like that. But how do you build that into the system?
Yep.
Direct it.
Very good question, and thank you for bringing it up as early as you did. Essentially, what we're going to look at is a number of best practices that were already successfully implemented. Now, it is not our intention that Victoria hospitals would implement them in exactly the same way. essentially, as we look at this British example, this Canadian example, and so on and so forth. And we have a couple of examples from Australia, essentially, one from New South Wales and one from Queensland, Brisbane, specifically. I'd be very, very interested in hearing your views, your opinions on what active ingredient from those best practices as implemented would travel well to Victoria, to the organizations, the hospitals, and other care providers that you work with, essentially, and what things you would like to change, which things you would tweak in order to make them Victoria compatible, so to speak. Our own definition of Victoria success is having a significant number of what we call second generation best practices. We'd be delighted if 6 months or 1 year down the line, basically, Marie reached out to us and say, you remember, that practice from that Canadian hospital in Ontario, basically, we run it in Victoria and our results are equal or better. And we publish those, by the way, on a regular basis. So we'd be more than happy to help you as you run through implementation. Okay, so yes, please.
I was just really interested when you said that the elderly and mental health patients are two groups that shouldn't be admitted automatically.
By default, yeah. The default is admission.
We're about to start a national royal commission into aged care, and we're starting a state royal commission into mental health. And we've got, I suppose, in terms of our population, we've got a faster ageing population in rural and regional Victoria. And I would think that the terms of reference for the Royal Commission into mental health are looking at the difficulty that a lot of people have getting into a hospital. So I'm just wondering where, what states and jurisdictions, did that evidence come from, and does it pertain to Victoria's situation?
That's a very good question. The short answer is no, essentially. The data that we have is global, not Victoria specific. And of course, we'd be more than happy to put our models of analysis at your disposal so you can plug Victoria data into them and see what results you get. But generally, and again, I'll talk more about this when we see the specific case studies, but I can give you two brief previews, essentially. When it comes to mental health, essentially, and we published last year a study, again, which you can access, called the Behavioral Health, because that's the name for mental health in the US, the Behavioral Health Management Guide. If you want the copy and you don't want to forget, use your evaluation forms. At the bottom of the form, please email me Behavioral Health Management Guide, and I'll make sure that Ben actually sends you the PDF afterwards. But essentially, we found the following. You need to tier your mental health or behavioral health populations across levels of acuity. This is something that's been done in population health management overall for a long time. It's much newer, much less typical with mental health patients. And you need to treat, essentially, the two lower levels of acuity, low risk and rising risk mental health patients, almost exclusively in a primary care environment. For those patients, we have found that acute interventions actually extend both their consumption of resources and the time devoted to treatment. Now, going on to the elderly portion of the population, the results are even more dramatic. The data comes from the NHS in that regard. They have determined, for example, that for every day hospitalization, every single day a person over the age of 65 spends occupying an inpatient bed, they lose at least 1% of their muscle mass. The average length of stay for a person over the age of 65 in a British hospital is 11 days. Okay, that means that when they are discharged, they are no longer independent, functional human beings. Somebody who has lost 11% of their muscle mass cannot go shopping on his or her own, cannot climb a flight of stairs, essentially. The hospital stay has rendered them almost irreversibly dependent on healthcare as a whole. They have created a long-term patient by virtue of extending that initial hospitalization, right? So for those two groups of patients, it's for everybody, but for those two groups of patients, it's crucial that we find alternatives other than the traditional hospital bed, the traditional acute care bed. It's better for us because nobody has enough beds. That shortage is global, if it makes you feel any better, essentially. But it's also particularly, specifically better for those two patient categories because the hospitalization in and of itself is bad. I mean, I used to scare people who told me, oh, there's no better place for mom than the hospital. That's where she's safest, basically. And I had to, reach back into our archive and claw out, basically, our studies on nosocomial infection rates. Really, whoa, is that what you want your mom? Basically, the new data says that nosocomial infections actually are a tiny portion of a much larger problem.
But I'd suggest with the sort of the low-hanging fruit in the mental health, those sort of acute, or there's sort of early and sort of rising acuity. It's the same for older people. If you can address those issues in a community setting, and therefore there will be a time when an older person comes into hospital because they've had a fall and a fracture, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's what you want to deal with priority. The trouble is our system's not really well geared to pick up people in that rising acuity phase. And how do we want to try and better manage that group?
And 18% of them transition from rising to high every year, right? Almost 1 in 5 crosses that line and they join the highest segment in terms of need and consumption. And they cross that segment at that rate because most of our resources, most of our attention has been devoted to the high acuity segment, right? There's many things to say about high acuity, high consumption patients, and most of them are negative, right? But there's one good thing about them. We know exactly who they are, almost by name, by virtue of how often they interact with us. The medium portion of the population, what we used to call medium risk, and now we relabeled a couple of years ago, rise in risk, basically, those people, more often than not, we detect, we catch after they've made the transition. How do we identify them before essentially they become super consumers? That's the name of the game. We're fighting or running against time in that regard. So essentially, let me start with the first macro category. This idea about visibility and quality of information that allows for real-time decision making as close as possible to where the patient is, as close as possible to the front line. We have 4 best practices here in this specific chapter, and they come from healthcare systems that are geographically really far apart, far away from each other, and that are funded differently, essentially. So I'm going to give you this potpourri, this salad of alternatives. I'd be very, very interested. One of them is Australian, as I mentioned before. Essentially, I'd be very interested in your take as to which one of these would actually better fit the problems of your patient population. And secondly, essentially, which one of these basically you think you are currently properly resourced to tackle, right? Because some of them might be great ideas, but they require, for example, basically staffing levels that you may not have. Or they require basically an IT interface that will only become a reality in 2022 or 2023, right? We have to assess the impact, but we also have to be realistic and assess the feasibility of each one of these options, right? So I'm going to ask you to essentially jump in and let me know where we are in that regard. We start with one of our members in the UK. This is Royal Wolverhampton NHS Trust. It's one of the coolest practices we have ever seen on the IT side of things. However, it's also a cautionary tale because their IT investment didn't yield any results, any returns. It was an IT expense instead of an IT investment until they changed something else that was not, fancy wires and moving screens in that regard. The situation that you see here basically is their ex ante situation, and it's a dire situation, as you can see. This is a hospital in the Midlands that had previously purchased a brand new hospital-wide tracking system. Essentially, their intent was to use it to radically change the way in which they think about managing patient flow essentially, and they did it. They built the business case to do this on the data that you see on this particular slide. Basically, on the left-hand side, you see that presentations to the emergency department rose by 23% over a 3-year period. Essentially, they had additional challenges that arose from that, breaches in the 4-hour target, a significant number of canceled elective surgical procedures because that surgical volume got occupied and exceeded by emergency surgeries and so on and so forth, right? So the first thing they do is they go to an American company called Teletracking. Have you heard of Teletracker? Doesn't matter. There's several vendors of that one. Basically, they sell high-tech thingamajigs and doo-wops, essentially. And they write a very large check, essentially, for teletracking, and they get, in exchange for that, basically an infrared monitoring system that they install across the entire hospital, essentially. They put RFID receptors in every single wall of the hospital, and then they tag patients, personnel, and equipment with RFID emitters. How many of you have read the Harry Potter books? Okay, so you remember from Harry Potter books the Marauders map? Okay, Harry could know in real time, where everybody was within Hogwarts. This is the non-magical version of the Marauders map. Essentially, there's somebody sitting in a command center looking at a screen, and they know essentially how long a physiotherapy session lasts, right? Because they have somebody walking into the room, and each staff tag is individual, right? So you know it's a PT. Right? Yeah, it's really, really cool. Okay, and they know, for example, whether the PT is in the same room as the charge nurse in charge of that patient, right? And on the basis of that, they can determine whether there's good interprofessional, multidisciplinary collaboration, because they're seeing the patient at the same time. You can assume that they're talking to each other, coordinating a care plan, coordinating a discharge plan. Every single piece of equipment has been tagged as well, right? The thing they told us is the one immediate return we got from this huge investment is the amount of time that we used to waste looking for lost piece of equipment went down to 0. The average search time for equipment is 25 seconds at this hospital, right? So that's the really, really cool one fueled exclusively by technology. Yes?
Did they tag patients as well?
Yes, yes. So the patient was tagged. So let's say the patient left the room to go get a chest x-ray or an MRI scan. Basically, you would know how much time they spent outside of the bed, how much of that time was wait time versus basically inside the MRI machine, and so on and so forth, right? There's a problem though. You can spend all the money in the world buying this super duper, basically, Minority Report, Tom Cruise handling mechanism, essentially, and still not get the desired results, which is essentially what happened to Wolverhampton, essentially, because they did have a patient flow management team, but the patient flow management team was actually very enamored of the old ways in which they did things. Rather than trust this new high-tech interface that had been put at their disposal, they preferred walking the wards, essentially. We get information about bed availability and possible patient transfers by talking face-to-face to people that actually manage the units in that regard. They had a high-tech interface and a siloed mentality coexisting at the same time within the hospital, right? So how do you collect information? We asked the team and said, well, we collected information by walking around, right? And when they were walking around, essentially, they were collecting information that more often than not was not up to date, was not that reliable, essentially. One member of the team would say, I go to 4B on the East Wing and I find essentially an available bed that is compatible with the needs of that patient that we have waiting, boarding in the emergency department. So I make a call so the patient can be brought up. Another member of the team could be doing pretty much the same thing roughly at the same time, right? So you have 2 patients coming up from the ED for one bed that is available. One of those is going to have to hit rewind. Is going to have to backtrack in that regard. Getting the team to use the tool was actually a much bigger challenge than funding or buying or putting the tool in place to begin with, right? Because again, they didn't trust the interface. How do we know this is going to give us information that is as reliable and as valuable as the information we get from relationships that we have invested years or decades in building, right? So Wolverhampton wanted these guys not just to adopt the tool, essentially, but also to love the process of adoption. So they set up, aside from that, something they called care traffic control. It's built like a tower in an airport, essentially. All the information is in the same place, and they ask half of the patient flow management team to sit there, and the other half to continue gathering information the old-fashioned way, by walking the hospital, walking the units. They run that experiment for 2 weeks, essentially. And that way, the members of the team themselves realized which of the two approaches was better. And they voluntarily embraced the technology, instead of having it pushed upon them by the powers that be, by the high hierarchies within the organization, right? So successful hospitals think beyond just the tech interface when it comes to solving this particular problem. Essentially, they pair the technology with this idea of a single command center, one place, essentially, where not just all the information is available in real time at the same time, but the right decision makers are in the same room at the same time as well, basically. And again, if you have people with the expertise having access to this very deep, very granular, very detailed information, from that they built insight, essentially. And from the insight they built, they confirmed, essentially, things not that are intuitively easy to figure out, such as the confirmed discharges for that day, but the potential discharges. Every time the ED reaches a near breach point, essentially, you start looking at the discharges that are scheduled for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and proactively doing something, figuring out whether to see whether those patients can be discharged today. So the people can go up from the ED, the patients can go up from the ED 24 hours earlier than originally anticipated. So you reduce length of stay, basically you reduce the chances of breach in the ED, and so on and so forth, right? But that trustworthiness of the system is only possible if the users of that information truly believe that it's going to be as reliable or more reliable than the old way, the muscle memory to which they're accustomed. And of course, it wouldn't be a best practice if we didn't have results, essentially, to share with you. As you can see here, basically, their volume of ED presentations has continued to increase. Okay, but the likelihood, the statistical frequency of ED breaches has decreased quite significantly as a result, right? So without additional physical capacity, they haven't added a single bed to the operation. They have significantly expedited patient flow right there, right? By decreasing length of stay and by actually being able to make decisions far earlier than they would have under the old data collection mechanism. What do you think? Does this feel like, sci-fi, Star Wars stuff? Does this feel like something that, you'd like some hospitals in Victoria to take a crack at? Impact and feasibility. It's like, the two halves of that coin, of that question.
How much was the investment in the tech?
It was a couple of $1 million. It was a couple of £1 million,
yeah,
essentially, in that regard. And again, remember, this is the NHS, right? Nobody is under the financial pressure that these guys are under. Their mandate is to reduce healthcare expenditures by 4% year over year over year. Your reward for reducing expenditures on year one is a further round of cuts for year two, right? So if they could make a business case that investment was worthwhile, it's because the returns were clear and tangible.
The other thing that's interesting, I suppose, maybe slightly diverse, is if we've got patients, for instance, older people who are staying too long in bed, we know deconditioning, this sort of system also allows you to track how long patients sit in beds, how much movement they do, how much nursing time is devoted to certain types of patients within certain types of units. So you could develop quite a sophisticated model around improving care processes as well as just having that sort of concept of oversight of flow as well. Yes.
We're doing it at the end delirium at the moment, and I can see how this kind of technology would link directly into that. So where are patients at certain times? How often do they get out of bed? That kind of thing.
And the other thing that jumped to me is that we have this, we invest a lot in telehealth and those sort of models, but at the end of the day, you've also got old-fashioned ways of doing business. You've got clinicians who might recognise that it's good technology, but it's not actually for us because we've always done it this way, and so you get this sort of it all looked very good. You put a lot of money into it, but in actual fact, the age-old practices will continue.
Yeah, that's true. I had a research interview with a surgeon in his late 50s a couple of years ago, and he told me that he started his day by calling his assistant at the hospital and asking her to print his emails because he wanted to read them on paper, right? Like he couldn't read emails on screen, right? So if you have somebody with that mentality thrown into the mix, you can spend as much money as you want on technology. Failing to change the habits of the power users of the system will hamstring any chance of actual change.
Yeah, I find the change management aspect, and you've talked about it with regard to Wolverhampton. How long did that, so obviously they implemented the technology, the patient flow team weren't using it. How long did it take for that, I guess, the change management to actually do its thing so that they did come around?
Well, that's a very good question. They do collect data quarterly, essentially, right? So they had to justify the significant investment they had made because they made a promise. We're going to buy this multi-million-dollar IT interface from Teletracker, essentially, and we're going to reduce costs at least that much in order to pay for, that, because otherwise we just bought the most expensive paperweight in the history of healthcare. And again, this is the NHS in the UK. They have a very long and sad history of buying technology that doesn't yield results, right? So once bitten, twice shy being the motto there. So 1 quarter later, essentially, the length of stay hadn't decreased as much as it should have. Basically, the frequency of ED breaches hadn't decreased at all, right? So they needed to get their act together. It's like, who's supposed to be using this? Well, the patient flow. It's like, what's hindering them from doing that? Well, for starters, they don't have a single physical place to sit down, right? So let's clear up that room and put all the monitors in the same place. And that gave birth to the idea of a care traffic control, which is what they call it, being somewhat cutesy.
Yeah. It's like a command center.
Right? But then they said, but how do I know that what's on the screen actually reflects the reality on the east wing of the hospital? And that is a valid concern, by the way. We have seen past instances of hospitals relying on IT interfaces. The IT interface is only as powerful as the quality of information it's entered into the interface. So, we found a hospital that had bought a very expensive IT tool from McKesson a couple of years ago, essentially, and what the tool revealed in terms of bed availability had nothing to do with actual availability in the ward, in the unit. Nurses were hiding beds for their friends, essentially. So what they did is they decoupled the bed status updating mechanism from nursing activities. They gave it to cleaning teams, hygiene, environmental teams, and transportation teams. And then the fidelity of the information, went up quite significantly.
Whereas this system doesn't rely on human, does it? It's all automatic.
Exactly. Again, I have never met an interface that was more complex than a human, personally. And I'm married, so you know where I'm coming from.
That's interesting.
So I'm not gonna hide the ball much longer, but there's one intrinsic weakness in this best practice. Can anybody guess what I'm talking about?
Is it human?
No, it's humans are weak most of the time, but this is different. Basically, there's something else essentially that limits the power of something like this. And the solution to that problem is actually an Australian solution. You'll be happy to hear.
Sorry.
I was saying it's probably really obvious.
I don't know, but one thing, I don't know if this is the answer to that question, but one thing I was thinking about was that they probably used and maximised the benefits of the relationships they'd established in terms of their walking around strategy in how they implemented change, because when they got all their monitoring data from their new IT system, they would have to go back out to talk to the people again, clinicians, to implement change, and that's when their relationships would come to the fore. So I don't know. If
Yeah,
that's
as a matter of fact, you have it's not on the slide, but overall job satisfaction at Wolverhampton went up by something like 15 or 17% ever since the proper implementation of care traffic control, right? Because all of those conflicts that arose before out of having inaccurate, not up-to-date information got solved by the better visibility, right? So that's definitely a thing. The inherent problem to this practice is that you cannot put RFID receivers all over the city. They're constrained by the hospital, essentially. This is a very acute-oriented solution, right? And it reinforces a bias that people that are hospital-based tend to have, basically. And it's the belief that patients magically materialize in the ED, and they had no entity, no existence before they cross, the door of the ED, and magically disappear in a puff of smoke when they're discharged. It's like, I know what happens to the patient in the acute environment just fine, basically. The rest of the patient journey, well, I either don't know, or I don't care, or it's a combination of both, essentially. How do we start tracking these patients when we don't have the benefit of wired walls, digital walls? In that regard, how we start looking at those patients and their needs and the right site of care for those patients before they cross our door, before they enter our facility. And essentially, here's the setup for the next practice. Basically, you have to move away from just looking at the internal flow of patients within the acute care setting, and look at what happens to those patients before admission and to an extent after discharge. Basically, every time you have something such as unplanned demand and readmissions of patients that keep coming back to the hospital, you can derail the most finely tuned in-hospital data collection mechanism. Wolverhampton itself essentially would encounter problems in that regard. So we need to expand the term patient flow to encompass prospective demand for the ED, which you see on the left-hand side of this slide, and prospective demand for post-acute care after the patients have been discharged. And that's going to allow hospital leaders to predict and to proactively manage flow within the acute care setting, but also taking into consideration the impact it's going to have on primary and post-acute care settings in that regard, right? Gold Coast University Hospital here in Australia found themselves precisely in that situation. They encountered as their most painful obstacle the lack of system-wide visibility, right? And for them, in the immediate term, that translated into huge staffing costs and very, very poor coordination of services across a multiplicity of care sites, some of them acute, some of them non-acute within the system. So the leaders knew that they needed to change something quickly and dramatically, but that change couldn't belong to the hospital on its own. It would only be successful contingent on much better collaboration and coordination with community partners, right? They needed to think about statewide investments instead of hospital-specific investments. The business case would have to be co-written, if you will, instead of written, right? So in order to do this, Gold Coast basically built a coordination hub. And again, just like Wolverhampton, just like their care traffic control, basically, the hub gives them a centralized snapshot of what is happening with flow. They rely on analytical tools developed by their own information systems team, right? So this is built in-house instead of bought from TeleTracker, essentially. It gives them up-to-minute details both within the hospital and basically in their catchment area, the community outside of the hospital. The tools enable clinical and admin staff. That's one of the key differences. Essentially, you have people in white and people not in white looking at the same information and accessing patient-level information. When the patients are still outside of the hospital, you see basically a snapshot or a screenshot of the dashboard right here. Beyond the technology, just like in the previous example, the most deliberate and valuable effort Gold Coast made essentially was to work with community partners in that regard. And the first community partner that they picked was the Queensland Ambulance Service, QAS, right? And not just by collating data with them. Gold Coast basically and QAS staff sit in the same place at the same time, right? So in mundane terms, think of the hospital essentially as the owner of the venue, the landlord, and QAS basically as a tenant that gets to hang out there for free with privileged status, so to speak. Because they think, okay, if we're together in the same place at the same time, we get to monitor and we get to respond to surges in flow much better than if we were to do that in isolation. So the partnership has allowed the hospital to have up to the minute insight into emergency service calls, right? The hospital, it's like, old 1970s cop movies, basically. If you have a police scanner, you know where the squad cars are going to. These guys know where the ambulances are going to, right? So if the patient is identified by name or by domicile, basically, you get to pull up the patient's file while the ambulance crew is still driving towards the patient home, right? And you have their past history, their level of acuity, according to the last discharge form related to that patient, where the closest hospital to that patient is located, to see if geographical convenience is the key criterion to determine where that patient has to be treated, and so on and so forth. That level of detail, that granularity, that insight enables the coordination hub team to assess patient needs against the current flow status at each one of those facilities, right? Look at the patient and their needs, essentially look at the hospital and their conditions, and actually make the best possible match between those two. Does this hospital have a unit that treats the patient's condition? Basically, do they have the clinical capabilities? Do they have available beds? Do they have a surgeon on call if it's an urgent surgery? And so on and so forth, right? And this all happens one step behind, one further step removed from the four walls of the hospital. The key difference between this one and Wolverhampton is this one has been built for a network, not for a site. Right? So as you can see, essentially they use this and they tailor it to a wide variety of different patient populations with different needs. At a basic level, basically the data allows them to create ED demand forecasts, essentially, and that forecast incorporates both clinical information, patient acuity, type of emergency, and so on and so forth, and environmental data as well. Where did the emergency happen? What are the current traffic patterns, essentially? And what's going to expedite care being provided to that patient?
Just out of interest, was
yeah.
it the CSIRO system that they put in place?
I
You don't know what the IT
no, I don't. I mean, I know that it was mostly developed in-house, essentially. So they may have used some open source code platform out there, but this was mostly done by them. Basically, the users of the system and the creators of the IT platform basically were batched the same way, which again, in and of itself, is a positive. Building these things in-house gives you a couple of advantages. Now, in practice, this means that patients get to access care faster, and it's the right care, the most appropriate care. It also means that able to access system-level visibility into patient flow and demand, ultimately improving hospital communication with QAS or any other partner that you care to choose. If you have a particularly difficult part of town that gives you a much higher patient flow volume, basically, you would be able to have in the same room at the same time the social workers that work in that part of town. And they would tell you, you're going to have this many overdoses a day, and you're going to have basically these many cases of domestic violence yielding patients with, blunt force trauma a day, and so on and so forth. And again, for some patient groups, speed of access makes a bigger difference than for others, right? So you start looking at population health management, basically, and subdividing your courses of action depending on patient needs in that regard. And again, not surprisingly, mental health was a top priority for Gold Coast because their previous data, their ex-ante data, showed that mental health patients didn't receive the appropriate care that they needed. Mental health patients can be particularly challenging as patient populations go. Mental health resources are even more scarce than general healthcare resources. For those of you with firsthand clinical experience, there is no worse place for a mental health patient than a traditional emergency department waiting room, and the same is true for the rest of the people sharing that waiting space for that with that patient, right? So now, because you have the information ahead of time, you don't have to rush and decide on your feet when the patient already has been presented to the ED, which was the default course of actions. Basically, the ED was Rome, and all roads led to it, essentially, in the ex-ante situation. When the QAS team responds to a 000 call for mental health crisis, they start working with the coordination hub before they even reach the patient, right? As the crew is driving to the patient, basically, the QAS officer in the hub is going to be in the same room at the same time, a desk across from a mental health specialist that is also located in the hub, right? So on the one hand, you have the QAS officer providing the mental health specialist with patient details, relevant information about the emergency, and then the mental health specialist is going to review patient records, make decisions based on the patient history, and then other available information, additional care needs that patient might have. Existing community support resources that might allow that patient to be detoured to a non-hospital site, and so on and so forth. Once the team arrives on scene, essentially they conduct an initial assessment of the patient, and then the mental health specialist conducts a telehealth triage. They have Wi-Fi enabled iPads that they use for that remote communication, basically. And at that point, then and there, they actually put in place an action plan, the one that maximizes the quality of care for that specific patient, right? If the patient is eligible to be managed by the community health team, they're referred or transported to that location. If the patient does require an acute intervention, because the event basically, has resulted in the kind of trauma that you can only treat at a hospital, the QS team is going to transport the patient to the ED. But at the same time, when the patient is being driven to the ED, the team in the hub is going to alert the hospital. You have a patient with these demographics and these specifics coming, basically, and this is the care plan for that patient after the immediate problem is solved in the ED. So he needs stitches, right? So after you're done with suture, you don't have to park them there and wait and see what happens. You have a care plan, and it might involve hospitalization or not, but you know ahead of time, instead of trying to decide on your own in a rushed ED what to do. And again, it wouldn't be a best practice if it didn't have results. Essentially, patients presenting to the ED with mental health needs now wait 2 hours less on average than they used before, so wait time reduced quite significantly. Nearly 100% patients triaged through the process, and almost all of those patients, almost half of those patients successfully diverted away from the hospital to a better care setting, and decreasing the pressure on the ED to begin with. The advantage, the benefits of having multiple perspectives in the same room at the same time. Essentially, none of these things could have been done by the QAS on its own. None of these things could have been done by the hospital on its own. This is the kind of thing that you either partner for or you abandon altogether. Coordination is the name of the game. And it's way cheaper, by the way, than Wolverhampton's alternative. It's a fraction of the cost.
It would reduce ambulance transfer time, and that's something that's really quite high on the minister's priority list at the moment
Yeah.
as well.
And again, if you do this successfully for, I don't know, a year or two, basically, that makes you more credible the next time you ask for money, right? So we have seen in New Zealand, basically, DHBs authorizing something called the GP ambulance, right? It looks exactly like an ambulance, but it doesn't have sirens, right? So you empower the ambulance teams to actually pre-triage the patient at home, and if it's clear that the patient needs care, but it's not necessarily acute care, instead of overcrowding an ED, and they're overcrowded 90% of the time, basically, they find, because they have integrated information systems, they find which GP in the catchment area has an open slot, that afternoon. So the patient gets driven to the GP instead of to the ED. New South Wales basically has a couple of mental health designated transportation vehicles, right? And they know where to take those patients, and it doesn't default to the ED and a hospital bed each and every time. One of the markers of success that we see for these initiatives essentially is that they grow in span and scope. And they only do so because everybody's strapped for resources. They only do so because they can prove, beyond doubt, that it's good return on investment.
I think what's attractive here as well, is hospitals think for themselves, starting to see themselves as a system and not just an isolated
True.
bricks and mortar that is impervious to these. And I think, we've had discussions with ambulance around older people, and they'll often go to the same older person 3 times to pick them up. And they always know the 4th time, or whatever it is going to be, the next time they go to pick them up, they'll have a fracture, so now they come into hospital. But all of those were moments for interventions, but there was no systematic response available. So the ambulance guys either leave them, pick them up, put them back in the chair. Maybe they might initiate ringing the GP, but that system's not necessarily going to get the specialists. Often the hospitals have all the specialists sitting there, and they're not necessarily available unless you hit the ED, and then the process starts. Here, this is sort of opening up those walls and letting specialists, and mental health specialists, for instance, and they often know their communities, so you're sort of getting earlier interventions without, and you say avoid unnecessarily coming to hospital when that could have been managed by another set of teams, but there's not the communication pathways easily.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you look at specialists, right? Specialists are 2 things within healthcare. The first one is they're usually the most expensive resource. The more you specialize, the higher a price point or salary you command if you're a clinician, right? And because they are very, very expensive and you have few of them, you can afford few of them, basically, you put them on the highest floor of the hospital, right? And you build within the hospital as many barriers as possible before somebody can reach the specialist. I'm going to find you basically so many diversions before you reach the specialist to make sure that only the cases that merit that, because of acuity, because of severity, reach the specialist. That has been a long established tradition. It's probably one of the toughest things to change when we want to expedite patient flow. You want to move some of those specialists, people with the decision-making capabilities, with the authoritative decision-making capabilities, as close as possible to the front door of the hospital, right? And that is extremely tough. That is extremely difficult, and no amount of technology would solve that, essentially, without a leadership willing to spend a significant amount of political capital within the organization. But it also goes to solving the divide between primary and acute care, right? So if you're hospital-based, as you're a specialist, and they ask you what's wrong with primary care, the people on the other side, you're going to say, you know what, primary care is not resolutive at all. They over-refer people to us all the time because they're risk-averse, because they don't want to deal with complex patients. Basically, the second it exceeds their comfort zone, they send them to the ED, and those patients become our problems. You ask the same question of the primary care people, and they say, oh yeah, the hospital in this solar system that we call healthcare, the hospital is the sun, basically, and we are Uranus, essentially. We have fewer resources, we have no access to their databases, and my top priority is my patient safety. So of course, if I feel I exceeded in my capabilities, I'm going to refer those patients. The closer to the front door of the hospital you move those specialists, the more accessible you make specialist support to people that are community-based outside of the hospital, the more perverse incentives you destroy. The more you basically bring resolutiveness basically as a feature of the system overall, not just the top floor of the hospital.
And one of the issues we have is, as an increasingly ageing population, more frail and vulnerable older people coming in, where do you sit your geriatricians? You put them in your subacute building, which is usually on a different facility in another suburb, and then you wonder why you've got problems with flow, because by the time they've circulated around the acute hospital, the people who could actually have dealt with those issues early on are all sitting waiting for the referral to come across. So you've already sort of set up a system that's going to be expensive and time consuming and the benefit to few. So how do we, getting those clinicians that we traditionally see as being the backdoor way of getting patients out, actually having those people at the front. And I suspect mental health is not too dissimilar a picture.
Mental health is probably the most algid one to solve in that regard, particularly because of the need for mental health patients to develop a rapport and a level of trust with clinicians. We have seen a couple of interesting things. Ontario has something called Great White Wall, or BIG, I don't remember exactly, Big White Wall essentially, and it's their self-service interface for mental health patients, right? And they have clinical teams actually monitoring patients. Actually, it's the big white wall is supposed to be a graffiti analogy, right? So patients go there and post their symptoms, the things they're struggling with. It works very well for low and moderate acuity, and you have clinical teams actually monitoring what's written on the wall. So they will contact the patients, introduce themselves by name, and say, you know what, within walking distance of where you live, there's going to be an afternoon session, and there's already 4 people, but there's slots for 2 more, basically, and the problems match your problems, right? And that person, the person facilitating that session, is a clinical social worker, essentially, and he will, at the end of the session, give you a care plan, and maybe include, if necessary, a referral to a clinical psychologist that is 2 metro stops away from where you live. And the appointment will happen within 72 hours of the session. And so, going and capturing precisely those patients that are, unfortunately, the least capable ones of navigating a discombobulated system on their own.
Yeah, I think the navigation's the challenge, isn't it? I mean, it's hard enough for people working in the system to navigate, let alone...
And again, it's like elderly patients and mental health patients, probably the two canaries in the gold mine when it comes to difficult to navigate systems. I want to show you the third component basically here. We've talked about information and its value in that regard, but the key question is, the next question is, what do you do essentially with that information? You can have the best data in the world essentially, but what comes next? Sometimes we come across members that have made significant investments in IT. Essentially, they don't have a lack of information problem. They have an inaction problem, so to speak. Inertia in that regard. This having a plethora of data, hospitals don't know when or if they were doing the right things. They were pursuing the right course of care for those patients. Without the right operational principles in place, without protocolizing or standardizing that, essentially, you can paint a very nice picture of what is happening. Your descriptive capabilities are okay, basically, and you can fail miserably at the prescriptive side of things, fixing the problem, basically, impacting patient flow at all, right? So you need a clear view of what's happening in real time. You have basically an example. This is another Canadian hospital. It's in Ontario. The name that you see across the top of the slide is a pseudonym. They're a real hospital, but they didn't authorize us to use their actual name. The IT platform they bought from GE, General Electric, and GE for some reason considers the advisory board to be a competitor. We're not. I wish we could compete against GE, trust me, essentially, but because of that, we had to pseudonym it, right? So you have essentially the ex ante situation of that of that slide, basically, you have a significant investment in IT and nothing that allows you to make decisions or turn that information into insight for the patient. Because there are missing pieces, because there are missing parts, right? The data analytics have to be in place. That's a hygiene factor. That's table stakes in that regard, just like the examples we have seen so far. The patient flow team, the care traffic control or the QAS hub, as you saw before, also have to be in place. But the one thing that you need to have first and foremost is actions, essentially. On the basis of the information they collected at this Ontario-based hospital, they essentially wrote 70 guidelines for clinical action based on the 70 most common patient types that presented to the hospital, right? So most hospitals will have one search protocol, right? It's a one-size-fits-all that in all honesty ends up being a one-size-fits-none, essentially. Because these guys had access to much more granular information because of the IT interface, they said, oh, wait a second, we don't have one problem. We have 70 problems. And they will require a degree of customization where we design the solution. And we're going to bake the steps in each one of those 70 action plans into the clinical workflow inside the hospital, right? So in the moment, in real time, very difficult, high pressure decision making that more often than not we force our frontline clinicians to make is no longer necessary, essentially. They can talk about instances of exception when they want to deviate from the protocol, but that's going to happen a much lower portion of the time, a much lower proportion of the time in that regard. So for each one of these 70, essentially, as you can see, they have put together a mechanism that resembles the examples that we saw before, and it allows them essentially to detect the breaches, the excessive demand that overwhelms capacity before they happen. When you have access to this information, actually you can look at leading indicators instead of working on lagging indicators, which unfortunately is what we do most often within healthcare, right? So these four elements that you can see here, basically you have a command center dashboard, just like the examples that we saw before. Basically, you have staff involved. Those two are not new when you compare them against the previous examples. The process steps and the triggers are, essentially. The triggers tell you, essentially, when you have 7 ambulances coming towards your ED and it's a Thursday afternoon, essentially, you need to activate a number of process steps that will allow you to liberate 4 beds on the 4th floor, right? And it's guided step by step in terms of how to do it. As much as possible as you can automate, you automate. You make it system dependent, essentially. And for the rest, you actually empower the members of the team to complete the actions that will free up that capacity in that regard. So you have one example here, right? So you have emergency medical services basically driving towards the emergency department in a volume and a number that allows you to see ahead of time, before they arrive, that you're going to have to ramp up, essentially, your intake capability, or shut down the ambulance bay and detour those ambulances to another facilities. That's happening long before the breach happened, hours in advance sometimes, right? So you activate the breach trigger, basically, alert allows you to activate the protocol, right? It goes in place, basically, the ED flow manager and his or her multidisciplinary team basically identify what needs to happen for this patient that is coming and what that patient means for the overall flow of the hospital, right? So internal medicine receives a warning. The ICU receives another warning. We want you to start thinking about ways in which you're going to create capacity for these patients to come in when they arrive. And if you tell us that it's impossible, we need to know as early as possible so we can detour those patients before they come in, and we have to park them and have them boarding in the ED, right? And then when pressure goes down, essentially, you actually feed that back into the mechanism. So you have real-time data constantly updating the basis on which you're going to make those decisions. So again, In terms of technology, very similar to the examples that we saw before. This one resembles basically digital wall in Wolverhampton most closely, but now nobody has to guess anything. Everything has been pre-codified and written down. And again, I wouldn't tell you that they've solved every problem they have. Some of the numbers that you see on the left-hand side of the slide are still scary numbers. This is a hospital that was essentially built in a part of Ontario, and all the demographic analysis they conducted before building the hospital established that the hospital was going to represent enough capacity for the next 11 years. Into their third year of operation, they were already breaching. So something was wrong, something was seriously wrong. You notice on the left-hand side, essentially, that they haven't solved all of those problems. It's still a dire situation per those metrics, but they're starting to buck the trend. They're starting to reverse the trend, essentially, by making a much better utilization of those resources. The source of hope is on the right-hand side of the slide.
One of the issues, I think, is hospitals often operate at 120% sort of capacity, really. So if you've got a command centre that needs to free up capacity, urgently, how do they do that if their capacity is already exceeded? Is there, maybe they will come on this.
No. It's a very good question. For Ontario, essentially, this is par for the course. This is what most hospitals are facing. I remember participating. I arrived early for one of my sessions in the Toronto metro area last year. It was almost a year ago, essentially. And this, since you're here early, would you like to do morning rounds with us? And I always take that opportunity, right? So people were like, every single unit was in the same place at the same time, basically, and they were talking about their delta, essentially, number of discharges planned for today, number of admissions, people that are coming through the ED, number of surgeries scheduled. It was a Thursday. And their delta was -5. They had 5 patients for whom, this is a almost 200-bed hospital, right? And they had 5 patients for whom there were no beds. They had no idea where they were going to put those 5 patients. And everybody else participating in the morning round was calm. I was freaking out, basically. I tried not to show it, but I could tell you my BP and my heart rate were off the charts, right? So the session ends, people shake hands and say goodbye, and they go back to their jobs. And the person that invited me to deliver the session basically is walking back with me to the auditorium, and I say, Elizabeth, basically, why was everybody so calm? Because there's 5 patients for whom you have no beds. You don't know where you're going to put them. And she says, Dan, today is the Thursday that precedes a long weekend. We have a 4-day weekend coming up, essentially. We would give our right arm, every last one of us, to have a delta of -5 every single Thursday in our lives. Basically, it's common to have -25, -35. Because of the long weekend, essentially, there's fewer procedures scheduled. There's fewer people coming to our ED. We will figure it out, basically. But she said, just to give you an idea, last week was the last time that we didn't have patients boarding in the gym. Basically, gyms, auditoriums, corridors, essentially being repurposed as patient holding spaces. So again, in Ontario, 120% of midnight occupancy is what they call Tuesday.
Northern Health had what was called Code Surge. They instituted that last winter, and so whenever there was a certain number of patients in the ED, they'd call a code over the, as they do in the hospitals, and people would drop what they're doing. They'd start discharging patients, come down to the ED, and really, they just were able to push patients through the ED. AB were just reporting back to us, wow, this is amazing. Like, that ED is being slammed, but we're just being able to turn over patients so quickly. So they're one of our best practice sites.
It's funny though that obviously those patients could have gone home. Did they need to have a code and flashing lights to all of a sudden go, oh yeah, we couldn't actually see that person.
Apparently.
What were they going to do if the lights didn't go off? The person
Yeah,
was
well,
just going to sit there.
that's what's happening everywhere else, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating that they only respond a bit like Pavlov's dog. I guess, don't they?
Yeah.
As soon as the light comes on, but
Yeah, well, we must
why wouldn't they
now
do
do
that
it.
before?
The way they ran,
Yeah.
I suppose they're around in the morning.
Yeah, and they
Then they come back,
reassess.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, it's a number of things, and again, when you look at, if you can look at the problem early enough, the solutions are small and incremental. More often than not, we have let this situation, we have allowed this situation to go on for too long a time, right? So, for example, if we had the ability to time travel, basically, we could look at data from a couple of years ago, and you would see the number of discharges throughout the week in a given hospital, right? So you have this many discharges on Monday and this many on Tuesday, and it usually goes up from Monday to Friday. You have most of your discharges on a Friday, right? And then you look at Saturday and Sunday, they fall off a cliff. If you have a discharge or two during the weekend, you're a lucky hospital. Essentially, you're ahead of the curve in that regard. There is no worse time in a hospital than Monday morning. Okay, everybody knows that. But we don't discharge patients during the weekend, because who discharges patients? Well, predominantly doctors. Do they show up in the hospital during the weekend? No. Who's in the hospital during the weekend that could discharge patients? Nurses. But more often than not, we don't allow nurses to sign discharge forms, right? We actually run this analysis in 2008 when we wrote Next Generation Capacity Management, the study that gave birth to a very long list of children, including this one. The second most reliable statistical predictor of an unnecessarily extended length of stay was admission on Friday. It was more powerful than any clinical indicator out there. When you admit a patient on Friday, essentially you almost automatically increase that patient length of stay by 2 days. I experienced it firsthand when my wife got pregnant for the second time. They scheduled her C-section on a Friday. And I went and said, you either move that to a Wednesday or we're going to a different hospital. No, don't worry, we're round. It's like, yeah, I don't care, basically. You can tell me whatever you want, basically. I don't trust you, basically. You're going to move the C-section to a Wednesday or we're going to a different hospital. And my wife was like, you're embarrassing me, It's like, we need these people to be on our side. It's like, no, we don't need them to be on our side. I already had a vasectomy. That's our last kid, basically. We can burn this bridge quite safely. Don't worry about it. And then, I harassed the crap out of them during her stay, basically. What needs to happen next? What's the step that's going to guarantee discharge by Friday? We were out of the hospital Friday morning at 11:45 a.m., essentially. But, not all patients have a very annoying researcher as their spouse, right? So you need to make this into a standardized process. I want to close this, and then we'll have a morning break. Essentially, I want to close this with the most aspirational case study that we have in this book. This comes from Albert Einstein Jewish Hospital. It's one of our private sector members in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. Actually, saying that it's a private sector member is already outdated. As when we profiled them, they were a private sector hospital. On the basis of what you're about to see, essentially now 40% of their capacity is in the public sector. They're a hybrid organization. The Brazilian Ministry of Health has actually given them 2 faltering public sector hospitals, 2 facilities to manage. And they say, if you can replicate what you did in your private sector side, your Morumbi flagship side, in these 2 public sector hospitals, basically, we will reshape healthcare for Brazil as a whole using your model. And Brazil is a country of 200 million people, to give you an idea of the size of the experiment, what's at stake. Essentially, I mentioned that the previous Canadian hospital had GE as their technology partner, Albert Einstein with Accenture. You can see the Accenture logo essentially at the top of this slide. They have an Accenture team working on-site, full-time inside the hospital, tweaking and fine-tuning this. And they got the IT interface from Accenture for next to nothing, for a nominal fee. Because obviously Accenture is giving it to them practically for free, essentially, in order to make sure that they build a very robust product that they can sell at a very significant premium elsewhere. There you go. So Albert Einstein is an organization that we have profiled repeatedly in the past. They appear in every second or third one of our studies because of the number of best practices they put into implementation, right? They have a shorter length of stay for every single condition than the national average within Brazil, but they still identified a couple of sticking points in their patient flow. So the average wait time for patients between their arrival in the ED and being assigned to an inpatient bed, if the patient was acute enough to justify a bed, was 1 hour and 27 minutes. And 40% of the time, basically, they rushed to find that patient a bed, anywhere. And assigning patients to suboptimal beds translated, as you can see, basically, into increased length of stay and higher likelihood of readmission. So they needed to fix those two problems. They contacted Accenture, essentially, and they decided that they were going to use their information to build two models, a demand forecasting model and a propensity model. They needed to know ahead of time, essentially, how many patients were likely to present to the emergency department every single Wednesday afternoon, depending on the day of the week, the time of the day, the month of the year, whether one of the two local soccer teams in Sao Paulo had a game or not at home that afternoon, and so on and so forth, right? So they looked at a huge amount of data and they built the model. It took them 7 months of data collection. That was the size of the sample required to do this. Now, for each patient, essentially, that presented to the ED, they needed to know what factors translated into that patient needing an admission into an acute care bed, or that patient being discharged directly from the ED back home, right? Now, they built that into a machine learning, artificial intelligence interface that runs through their EMR. They're Cerner. They're the largest Cerner shop outside of the US right now, right? So the AI interface basically pulls data out of Cerner, basically, and yields a report that is used by the people that are in a centralized hub, just like the ones that we saw before, essentially. As a result of this, basically, in real time, as the patient is being treated in the ED, the system updates as to the propensity score. What is the likelihood of this patient needing to be hospitalized, right? So the results of the blood test come back, essentially. On the basis of the result, the score that you see on the left-hand side of that monitor either increases or decreases, right? So while the patient is being treated in the ED, you figure out not just essentially whether that patient is going to need a bed, but what's the ideal bed for that patient. The system spits out two alternatives, a plan A and a plan B, essentially. And the idea is that the plan A bed is the bed that is going to entail the lower risk level for the patient, the shortest length of stay, and the lowest likelihood of readmission. All of this is made available to the clinicians so they can make the call, they can make the decision. The system decides nothing on its own. Not a single person dressed in white is going to be replaced by Alexa. That is not going to happen. But by standardizing all those things that a human brain couldn't process at the same speed, it allows them to use the capabilities that only humans do have, that soft judgment, for those patients that are atypical in nature, to deal with the exceptions instead of dealing with the rules in that regard. Now, compare what they're experiencing now with the information that we saw a few minutes ago, a couple of slides ago. Basically, on average, it takes them 7 minutes to determine ideal patient placement. Patient arrives in the ED 7 minutes later, essentially. The patient's gonna be. Currently, 94% of the time they're able to put patients in the right bed, as opposed to 50% of the time, which was the case before. And the significant investment they made in this interface paid for itself in less than a year and a half. They're actually right now piloting a second version of this that will be devoted specifically to surgical patients. They think they can do away with block allocation altogether. They no longer have to use block, which will force us to write our own best practice research on surgical management, by the way. Thank you, guys. But they think they can do away with specialty-specific block allocation if they bake artificial intelligence into their surgical flow management issue. So again, this is probably where we're all going to be in the near future. I don't expect publicly funded healthcare systems to be able to do this right now. So impact, very, very high for a practice like this one. Feasibility for Victoria within 2019, probably very, very low in that regard. Artificial intelligence is coming, machine learning is coming, and they're both arriving far sooner than anyone, ourselves at the advisory board included, expected. So keep this one in the back of your mind, basically, and start thinking about how you're going to write the business case for it. Because it's no longer acceptable for healthcare to be the only industry that hasn't tapped into this resource. I mean, Google Hangouts knows where I am every single day. This morning, I got a notification of where I was by Google Hangouts, and I got Facebook asking me to upload a selfie of myself at the 4 Points Docklands, which is a very nice hotel, but not selfie worthy. Right? If they know where I am in real time, and their platform can actually allow them to contact me that way and to provide me with a course of action, why isn't my healthcare provider doing the same thing? Why didn't I get an alert from United Health telling me, hey, you're at the hotel and you haven't been to the gym, basically stay away from the donuts, oatmeal for breakfast for you, that sort of thing. So again, this is coming way sooner than anyone expected. So we should definitely keep an eye on this. We are slightly behind the morning break. You've more than earned it. Let's reconvene in 15 minutes, and we'll look at the rest of the practices in the study. And again, when you come back, I'd be very, very interested, basically, in if anybody, this is voluntary, I'm not going to hold anyone to it, but if anybody wants to do a 2-minute highlights of chapter 1, what spoke to you, basically, you're welcome to do so. Before we jump back into content, basically, for those of you in the room now, each one of you should have one of these in front of you, an evaluation form. The top of the evaluation form is self-explanatory. Basically, you get to tell me how funny or unfunny my jokes were there. The bottom of the form is probably the most important part of it, okay? Because it asks you 2 questions. Question 1 pertains to the topic that we have covered today. Is there anything else on patient flow that you feel you needed more time for? Would you like to request a follow-up session, a Q&A over the phone, a video conference for people that you think should have been here but couldn't today, that sort of thing. That's how you answer question 1. Question number 2 is if there's any other topic you're working on, different from patient flow management, in which the advisory board could help you with our 40 plus years worth of a research canon. Essentially. So make sure if you're going to answer either one of those questions in the positive, if you need support with one of those things, that you include your name and your institutional, your Victoria Department of Health email address, essentially, because that's the email address to which we're going to send you the support resources. Most of the resources we're going to send you are hyperlinks that you can download, that you can use to download things from the website. How many of you here have active profiles on the website, on the advisory board website? Okay, so about half of you. For those of you who don't have an active profile on the website, basically your email address, your institutional email address, is your username. The first time that you log in, the system is going to generate an email that lands in your inbox with a hyperlink. You click on the hyperlink, essentially to verify that you are who you claim to be, essentially, and from that point forward, the website will recognize you by name, will greet you by name if you allow it to install cookies, right? The profile goes dormant if you don't use it in 90 days. So make sure you log in every 90 days. And there are 2 rules when it comes to using the website. And they're easy to remember because they're 2 numbers. The first number is 3, and the second one is 30. Never spend more than 3 minutes looking for anything on the website. If you hit the 3-minute mark and you haven't found what you're looking for, and you're not Bono, essentially, email Ben Gregory in the Sydney office, okay? Say, Ben, I'm looking for the following thing, essentially, and I haven't found it on the website. Get one of the nerds in Washington, D.C. to find it for me. Okay? You don't have to spend more than 3 minutes browsing. If you find something that you're looking for and it just happens to be a 225-page study, don't ever spend more than 30 minutes reading through that study if you don't want to. If you're the kind of person that learns by reading, if you have long flights or train rides coming up and you want to read the study, go ahead, knock yourselves out. But you don't have to, essentially. If you don't have time to read 225 pages, email Ben Gregory and say, Ben, I need one of the Washington, D.C. based nerds to walk me through the key teaching points of this study. Okay? Ben's job description is to make sure that the Department of Health gets value from its membership. Okay? So that's, you're actually getting him to do his job when you send those emails. And it doesn't matter whether one of you or 1,000 of you sign up for the website, basically. That translates into zero marginal cost for the Department of Health. Okay, this is an unlimited utilization model. All right, so let's jump back into content, essentially. From column 2, from chapter 2, we're going to look at one practice in detail, the German example, at the top of the column, and then I'm going to show you a few key slides for the other 2 examples. Because in Australia, you're actually more advanced than our average member. In Victoria specifically, you're more advanced than our average member when it comes to other 2 topics. And then in column 3, we're going to look at one example in detail as well. And then I'm going to close by showing you one feature of the British case at the very end. So let's go to the Germans, essentially, for a second. Let me skip this. Essentially, okay. So we have essentially identified one patient population that is more predictable than most other patient populations. And they're patients with scheduled procedures. Surgical patients would be essentially the excellent or the epitome of that example. Electrophysiology patients, basically, and other patients that need to come back on a regular basis for, say, chemo, for example. Patients that are predictable calendar-wise in that regard. For every patient population for whom you have planned admissions, there's room for improvement in their care plans so as to make patient flow management optimal, far better than it is right now. The example that we have here comes from Evangelische Lungen Clinic, which I shall not repeat again because I don't speak any German. They will be ELK from now on, basically. This is a specialty lung hospital in Berlin. The majority of their patients are planned admissions for acute treatment of chronic conditions. Lung cancer represents something like 40% of their total patient occupancy. And they're a tiny hospital. They don't even reach the 200-bed mark in that regard. Now, despite knowing in advance, despite having a lot of advantages in terms of how many patients they can expect on any given day, and despite having another advantage, a relatively narrow scope of practice, ELK experienced significant variation, roller coaster-like variation, basically, in length of stay with patients that had exactly the same diagnosis and exactly the same treatment plans. Right? So 2 patients that were clinically identical had completely different resource utilization markers, completely different length of stays. Basically, that is unwarranted care variation at its worst, essentially, then and there. Some patients were spending as many as 2 extra days occupying one of those hospital beds before they even had their planned procedure. When leaders at the hospital started looking for the root cause of this, why is this happening? Why does this variation exist? Essentially, they realized that there was little to no pre-planning. Essentially, the show started when patients showed up, whereas the show should have started long before the patients walked into the hospital. Most tests were not scheduled until after the patient met with their treating doctor at the hospital. If this happened later in the day, essentially, if there was any delay in the assessment the doctor made of that patient, the patient ends up waiting much longer than necessary to begin testing. And because diagnostic ordering happened on an ad hoc basis, the people in the lab, the people in imaging, basically, felt that sometimes nothing came through, and sometimes all the doctors were ordering the same test at the same time, exceeding their capacity, right? The hospital realized they needed to shift the way in which they work. They needed to be able to know what they could expect and how they could reasonably predict and respond to the patient types that were going to come through the door at that point in time, right? So they decided, in typical German fashion, to make a schedule. I'm oversimplifying this because I like making fun of the Germans. But essentially, there's more. We'll see what else is there. But they created a schedule for every single patient. That's at the core of their change, basically reducing the variation in timing for patients and the tests required at the hospital. Basically, led them to create a standardized pre-scheduled treatment plan for every single patient time. You're coming to see us with lung cancer, and we look at basically the last 6 months worth of lung cancer patients that we have treated here. And we know that these tests are necessary in the vast majority of those times, right? So we're going to pre-schedule your tests to make sure they don't conflict, they don't happen after imaging has closed down, and so on and so forth. Now, remember the examples we saw before the break? They had command and control centers, they had IT databases. This is a smaller hospital with a smaller budget in Germany. They have a guy, essentially. And again, because this is Germany, I'm going to call him Dietrich. I don't know what his actual name is, but they have Dietrich, essentially. Dietrich is their command and control center. A scheduler that is going to use prior work done by clinicians to identify the major reason for admissions. Because remember, this is a hospital to which patients are referred by their GPs, right? You know days in advance, sometimes weeks in advance, when they're coming and why it is that they're coming, right? And for each one of those patient types, when the patients presenting under a condition meet a critical mass requirement, the number of cases, you build a care pathway for that patient profile, for that condition. Now, the care pathway determines what needs to happen with that patient, what action steps need to be taken. Par for the course so far. Most care pathways do that. But it also determines the optimal order, the sequence in which things should happen. Because before, essentially, these guys would schedule 2 tests. And one of the tests would have to happen with a patient who hadn't eaten. It required fasting. And the other test could only be conducted after the patient ate. If you put those 2, essentially, in the wrong order, you're baking 24 hours of unnecessary length of stay just by virtue of making that mistake. So the order, the chronological order, the sequencing of testing is as important as the thoroughness of the list of procedures that you need to put into operation, right? So order being crucial in that regard. Now, let me show you what this looks like from the perspective of the patient. This is what you're seeing here are snapshots of what the clinical teams and the scheduler are seeing within the organization. So for example, let's say that you work for imaging, essentially, you would know as the head of imaging that on Mondays, basically in the morning, you cannot schedule any x-rays on your own, because we have a high enough number of patients that will require x-rays coming into the hospital that Monday morning, essentially, and we need you to save that capacity for those patients. So they're centralizing, essentially, scheduling for areas of the hospital, including ancillary services, such as radiology or imaging, essentially on the basis of that ideal plan that the scheduler has put together. From the perspective of the patient, on the other hand, essentially, this is what it looks like. Much easier to read, essentially, much more navigatable, if you will. And it details the sequence of the diagnostic testing for the first 2 or 3 days of that patient's inpatient stay, essentially. Patients come in, just like they did before. They have an initial consult with their doctor. And this is important, okay? This is not a deus ex machina practice, essentially. If the doctor finds during that initial consultation that this patient deviates from the type, cannot be subsumed 100% into the standard, the doctor can order exceptions. You don't take away clinical decision-making capabilities. But more often than not, basically, the doctors stick to the protocol, right? The patients basically have that initial consult with the doctor. Basically, it ensures the doctor can assess the needs of the patient, add or remove those tests, as I mentioned before. But having a plan that might be slightly reworked is better than having no plan at all, because it reduces variation. Now, interestingly enough, look at the number of activities. Basically, at no point in time there's a reference to the patient going to his room or seeing his bed there. The schedule is designed to keep the patient moving, essentially. The patients come into the hospital, they walk them to the room, they show them the room. We do have a bed for you, Mr. Johansson, essentially. It's there. You'll have a place to stay tonight. Don't take your shoes off yet. Don't take your clothes off yet. Don't put on that ridiculous gown that for some reason continues to open in the back. I still don't know why they haven't, reshaped that one. Essentially, come with me. I'm going to take you to your first test. And from your first test, somebody from that department is going to walk you to your second test, and so on and so forth. Right? They told us that sounds tiny and minor, but it actually makes a huge difference, basically. If you don't horizontalize the patient at the beginning, you make the patient an actor in the play that is their own care. If you put them in a bed at the very beginning, they get the feeling that they have nothing to do. They're just waiting for other people to perform activities. Patient activation is one of the most important topics as of late in the advisory board research canon, and this is one of the great examples that we have seen fairly recently. Right? By not putting them in a bed right away, the hospital has subtly but powerfully changed the expectations of the patient. Admission doesn't mean you get to lay down and relax. Things are going to be happening, and you have a part to play in that regard. Now, this process, of course, is going to require a robust understanding on the part of the patients, the diagnostic process, and the schedule of the hospital, but it has allowed EKL to ensure significantly better outcomes and to reduce inefficiencies. Remember, this is a tiny, tiny hospital. Every incremental gain in capacity utilization is huge for them, right? You can see the indicators right here, basically. They have seen a reduction of 50% in their average length of stay for those patients. They're getting half as many of those bed days back just by virtue of implementing this mechanism. And the number of patients they treated, basically, went up by 500 in the first 6 months of implementation. Right? So they went from treating 6,000 patients to treating 6,500 patients in the same period with the same resources. They didn't have to hire a single extra FTE. They didn't have to construct a single extra bed then and there. Right? So again, this will not work for every single patient cohort. Okay? You couldn't possibly do this with the more unpredictable patients, the multimorbid ones, the ones that have significant social determinants in their care. For those patients that are, to a degree, standardizable, predictable, basically, you have no excuse not to try something like this. This is probably the lowest hanging fruit as practices go within this study. And again, we used lung cancer patients essentially, because that was the biggest gap between where Germany is and where they need to be. As it happens, we presented this here in New Zealand. Essentially, your own treatment of lung cancer patients is already more efficient than what these guys do. Many of the things that at Evangelische require hospitalization, Australian hospitals are already treating in a completely outpatient or ambulatory setting, right? Don't get caught up in that detail. Okay, it's actually accidental that these are lung cancer patients. You have to determine within Victoria, essentially, which is the patient population that should have a much more efficient, streamlined patient flow, but currently doesn't.
I can give an example of something not too dissimilar. In West Australia, they have chronic pain clinics, and they have enormous wait lists, and we have similar models here. And the model basically is you get referred, you have to see the specialist doctor who then refers you generally to the multidisciplinary team. So they turned that around and said, okay, the person that's referred goes straight to the multidisciplinary team, who then determine if they need to see the specialist. And not surprisingly, they knocked out about 70% of the people who didn't actually need to see the specialist, and then the specialist time was freed up to see people at a more quicker way. And so it was that sort of a similar model where you sort of got people who have to see a specialist doctor who then prescribes all the things that you already know that person's going to probably need in the first place. Mm-hmm. So put them through that first, and then you'll filter out that in actual fact you're dealing with people who have got issues that are much more multidisciplinary and could be managed in a different way. But if it is if they do need the specialist medical side of things, then that becomes much more available, and then they don't go on this 3 to 4 month wait list.
Yeah. So redeploy those scarce resources to the people that need them the most. Essentially, that's the long and the short.
Sort of similar. You have
Yeah.
to rethink how you do your process.
Yeah, and again, the more predictable. If you were to tell me that you want to build something like this for patients that are extremely complex and for a sample size that is small, I would say no. Run in an opposite direction. This is the kind of thing that gets justified when you have a significant cohort of patients that essentially can be put into a box for whom you can build a single standardized protocol, right? So critical mass is one key factor basically, and patients responding the same way to the standardized process would be the other key factor, right? So I would say patients that require ports. Patients, surgical patients would be the other. Patients that need to come back for 2, 3, 9, 10 courses of chemo, that sort of thing. The value of the information is standardization here and there. I want to show you very quickly a couple of other things that we saw. Again, I won't go into each practice in detail, but the question behind the Evangelische model is something happening at any point in time in the patient's care journey that guarantees that patient is not sitting or laying down idle, essentially. Now, one of the most important idle times that we encounter during hospitalization has to do with diagnostic testing, right? So you can see the model, the traditional model on the left-hand side of this slide. Essentially, more often than not, basically, we receive a patient, the patient is admitted, and the patient basically sits down and waits for testing to happen. And because we have grown up in a world where we cannot trust patients, or we're told we cannot trust patients, basically, we want to keep them under our command and control as much as possible. I have you here, I've taken away your clothes, you're wearing the stupid robe that's opens in the back, basically. I'm going to do your x-ray and your MRI and your CAT scans, basically, while I have you naked and under my command. Right? But that is a lot of idle time for that patient to be occupying a bed, basically. This British hospital, this is an example from the UK, on the other hand of the slide, basically, reduces the length of stay to the time required to determine which tests that patient will need. And then the patient comes back to a virtual diagnostic ward. Exactly the same tests do happen without that patient occupying a very scarce, very valuable inpatient bed during the intervening period of time. Again, a couple of caveats regarding implementation. This will only work with patients that are easily reachable. Bradford, which is this British NHS trust, basically only does this with patients that have cell phones, for example. Only does this with patients that live within 40 minutes, a 40-minute drive to the hospital, and so on and so forth. You have to be very, very targeted in terms of how to do this, because just not to spend those inpatient bed days, you cannot give up on process discipline related to testing. But for those patients that meet those requirements, there's no point, there's no need in you having them in the hospital, essentially, while they're just sitting and waiting. And again, let me show you. Again, these are these are the examples in terms of the capacity gains that you make across the top of the slide. The referral criteria and the conditions, basically, we already talked about, so you can ignore the top of the slide. But you can see the volume of patients referred to the virtual ward, basically almost 400 during the initial 6-month trial. About a test and a quarter on average schedule in the virtual ward for each one of those patients. This is essentially the huge one when you look at efficiency indicators. 1,300 bed days saved. We're talking about the equivalent of building another extra wing for that hospital, and you don't have to anymore. And you're going to have to sell this to people that are hospital-based, right? Look at the last indicator, bottom right-hand side of the slide. Patient satisfaction shoots through the roof. Okay, these patients get to go back home, get to basically wait for the test in an environment where they can make their own tea, where they can sleep in their own bed, instead of being put in a hospital, basically, which increases their level of uncertainty and stress while they're just sitting and waiting and not understanding what all of these people dressed in white are speaking about.
I can also see that working really well for rural people who have to travel long distances. that, you know, if you chunk and block in the time that they have all their diagnostic tests done, and they know they're going to go back home to wait for that hospital bed, or, you know, you make it sequential so it all happens,
Yeah.
you know, quickly, then it's less travelling for the patient and for their family, and a much easier process, I would hope.
Yeah.
And you'd have to
Yeah.
rebook parking for them as well. 'cause that's
Yeah,
always the
yes,
issue.
oh yes. But you know, instead of going backwards and forwards and not knowing when you're going to have the diagnostic test, when you're going to get a hospital bed,
Yeah.
it'd be a lot more useful.
Absolutely.
Working in healthcare, we hardly ever have the opportunity to deliver good news to patients, right? If they're interacting with you, most of the news they're going to receive basically are bad news. The best thing you can get is good news. No problem there. The second best thing you can get is bad news as early as possible, essentially. And this essentially expands the visibility of what's going to happen to that patient, not just to the rest of the clinical team, which is something that we should always do, but also to the patients and the patient's family, right? And if you have a support infrastructure, if you have a hotline, a phone hotline they can call for those sort of things, basically, or if you have alternative housing for patients and families while they're waiting, instead of just parking them in a hospital bed forever and ever, which unfortunately has become the default, like there's no reason not to take those courses of action.
A couple of years ago, the department supported a project that looked at doing X-rays on older people who were in nursing homes. They may have had a fall or had an incident, and the X-ray basically went to them, because you're looking at a very frail group of people who are often cognitively impaired, so the thought of throwing them into an ambulance, dragging them into the hospital, waiting on a trolley for an hour or two, waiting for an X-ray was hugely problematic. And it was very effective. The interesting thing was, how do you fund it ongoing? So, you know, the Commonwealth government funds, through Medicare, X-rays, but they won't fund that. So the system falls apart. So it's quite interesting, even though we know these models can potentially have great impact. So you're doing something outside of the hospital. You're not using, so you know, hospital X-rays can be then left for people who've got emergency needs to come through the emergency. They're not waiting for people. So it's a fascinating conundrum, because you've got good ideas which are often blocked by policies that are government policies that aren't helpful.
We essentially have a healthcare system that has been designed around the patient that doesn't exist anymore, right? So like we have healthcare that is separated, divided between acute and primary care, right? Those two pure patient types don't exist anymore. It's like, when was the last year on record during which most hospital beds were occupied by monomorbid acute patients? I'll give you 10 guesses and you won't get it. The last year on record, essentially, during which 51 or more than 51% of in-hospital beds were occupied by the patients for whom those beds were designed, which is, hospitals are designed for acute monomorbid patients, essentially. When's the last time that happened?
Probably
81.
81, no, really, no. Yeah, during a war, I reckon a war hospital would probably be the only one I can think of.
1987, okay? 1987 in the US, OECD countries have very similar data, so Australia might be 85 or 89, but essentially in the US it's 87. 1987 was the last year in the US during which 51 or more than 51% of beds were occupied by acute monomorbid patients. In 1987, the A-Team was still on TV. Okay, that's how long it's been. The A-Team, the TV series, not the movie. Okay, nothing involved with Liam Neeson, particularly lately, right? When we keep operating, I mean, most of the patients that occupy hospital beds today basically are chronic multimorbid with a significant influence of psychosocial non-clinical issues into the mix, right? So this division between acute and primary doesn't work anymore. Right? It's like primary care used to be for a patient that has a minor boo-boo, right? And acute used to be for the patient that needs a heart transplant, right? We have 500,000 shades of gray in between those two right now. And funding, even more so, continues to follow that model with that clear dividing line between primary and acute, right? So as long as we have those constraints, all of the things that we implement are going to be patches, essentially.
I always find it funny, the Commonwealth argument about, constraining general practice costs. And yet general practice cost is what, 8-9% of the total health budget. The rest of the 92% has been swallowed up by acute hospitals. And yet we sort of, and then don't even get started on preventative processes.
I had an analyst in my research team, and I commissioned him with creating a costing model that would look at the cost of healthcare per square meter. He was an American, so I told him square feet so he'd understand it, right? Cost of healthcare per square meter, depending on the location of that meter. He resigned about 3 months later, so it was a very tall order. We don't have the model, but the data that he did gather essentially proved that there's essentially nothing worse, nothing more inefficient than an avoidable admission, right? Because the most expensive square meter in a hospital essentially is the ICU. The second most expensive square meter in a hospital is either in the OR or the emergency department, depending on the composition of their patient volume. The cheapest square meter in healthcare, essentially, is the GP's office. Orders of magnitude cheaper in that regard. Every time you avoid an unnecessary admission, you could give primary care, community-based care, basically 10 times more money than what they currently receive. Right? So, on that one, basically, it's still a head scratcher to this very day. And poor Aaron actually resigned and probably decided to grow tomatoes somewhere instead. I want to show you one more thing here before we will actually show you the Matter case in Queensland. Let me jump. This is discharge to assess, by the way. And again, we have countless flavors of discharge to assess because it's been implemented differently country to country. If discharge to assess is something that you want to push forward, we probably need a separate session to go into the countless details. Please, if that's the case, write that down in your evaluation forms. I will find a date and a time that works for you. But essentially, I wanted to show you one British example, the Pennine example, top right-hand side of the slide. I'm going to show you one or two slides for that one because it's deceptively simple and extremely powerfine in that regard. And it goes to the point that we made at the beginning of the day. Changing the default is key in that regard. Pennine essentially is a hospital that had an ambulatory unit adjacent to the hospital. Essentially, an outpatient unit adjacent to the hospital. The mandate essentially was that between 20 and 25% of the patients that showed up at the Pennine's ED or A&E, as they call them in the UK, would be referred to the ambulatory outpatient unit. And again, that followed their own triage data. It was something that could be done without increasing the risk level for each one of those patients. Look at the actual numbers. Essentially, only 9% of those patients were being sent there. They started looking at the reasons why. They started looking at why that unit was underutilized, had idle capacity, while the hospital basically was coming apart at the seams in that regard. And they realized, essentially, that the criteria to decide which way to send the patients was extremely complicated. When you're in a rush, when you have too many patients coming in via the ambulance bay, basically, if the criteria is too complex, regardless of how good it might be, if it's too complex, if it takes you too much time and effort to actually discern its meaning, you're going to default to what you consider the safest course of action, and that is always an inpatient bed on the 4th floor, essentially. So instead of using an inclusion criteria, essentially, in order to change that flow, to make the default not the admission, but the referral to the ambulatory unit, they created an exclusion criteria. And what you're looking at is it. That's not the first page of a 27-page document, okay? That is it, essentially. Patients go to the ambulatory unit unless they meet the criteria inside that red box. If your patient doesn't present any of those things, ambulatory unit is their new default destination. Now, this requires a degree of vigilance and discipline and implementation that, quite frankly, we haven't seen in too many places outside of Pennine. A copy of the criteria is given to the ambulance teams that are going to pick up the patients. So they determine en route, when they're on the way back to the hospital, basically, to which door, to which bay they're going to go with the ambulance, essentially. The criteria, essentially, is posted many times as visibly as possible on the corridor that links the ambulance bay to the emergency department. So if everybody overlooked the criteria while they were driving to the hospital, they have yet another chance to turn left and go to the ambulatory unit. The emergency department has members of the ambulatory unit rounding on patients that are waiting in the ED with the criteria in hand. So if they detect somebody that landed in the wrong place, they move into the criteria, to the ambulatory unit. So we call this the Debbie Harry implementation technique. If you're blown defense, one way or another, I'm gonna get you. Okay? So if patients belong in ambulatory, they will end up in ambulatories. And you see essentially there's an escalation in the number of assessments that guarantees that no patient who doesn't strictly need an acute care bed ends up in an acute care bed. Now, of course, this means that you need to move resolutive capability to the front door, right? The ambulatory unit ex ante, before this got implemented, had no physicians in it. It was a nurse-operated and commanded unit. Now, essentially, they have beefed up the medical decision-making power on that side in order to make it more likely that people will refer patients that way instead of an inpatient bed with far more confidence. So you have to do that sort of thing. In their case, by the way, it required hiring 0 extra FTEs. They just redeployed people that they had. And look at the results, basically. They've almost tripled the number of people that get moved to ambulatory, right, across the top of the slide. And look essentially at the coverage indicators, the treatment indicators across the bottom of the slide, right? Without any additional resources, basically, they have improved pretty much every single efficiency indicator they have, and a proxy for patient satisfaction as well. The number of patients that leave without being seen basically has decreased by 1/3. And now, let me essentially, we already talked about, this is, by the way, another Australian practice. This is Hunter, New England, in New South Wales. It is essentially designed specifically for patients' mental health, behavioral health patients. It has a few elements in common with the Queensland practice that we saw earlier at the beginning of the session. We're in Victoria, essentially the birthplace of PACER. You're all familiar with PACER, right? Okay, so essentially this is the 2018 generation of PACER enabled by much better technology. If you were to go back in time to PACER and have iPads available back then, you would have Hunter, New England, right? So this is how best practices evolve in that regard. Again, happy to go back to it during a Q&A session or a video conference. But I wanted to show you the practice that we think is probably the most counterintuitive within the study, essentially. We know for a fact that as patients get older and they become more frail, essentially, we overcare for them. We provide excessive care that is detrimental to the resource availability for the system, for the network of providers, and that more often than not is detrimental to the actual clinical outcome for those patients. We talked about the loss of muscle mass earlier today, prompted by your question in that regard. You have yet another indicator of the same thing here. Basically, elderly patients that get hospitalized essentially almost inevitably enter into a vicious cycle of readmission and loss of capabilities. Now we have an additional problem with patients that reach a certain age, particularly if they lose cognitive capabilities in the process, okay? A patient that is able to make decisions on his or her own after a certain age, more often than not, makes decisions that are functional to himself or herself and to the system. Most elderly patients with their cognitive capabilities intact continue to favor their quality of life over the chronological extension of their lives. The problem arises when patients lose cognitive capabilities and the decision-making power shifts to the patient's family. Every time you have children or grandchildren making decisions on behalf of mom, grandma, whoever it might be, data show essentially that they do choose predominantly those options that extend the patient's chronological life at the expense of quality of life. There's a guilt that comes into the equation. Oh, she raised me. I cannot basically not do everything in my power to save her, to keep her alive, right? So a group of nurses at Matter decided to switch that default. This is a practice that has been basically pioneered at first with the patient population that was staying in old folks' homes, and now basically it's been put into implementation for all patients that present to a Matter emergency department over the age of 65. Basically, it's expanded the scope on the basis of the initial results. The patient presents. The patient doesn't have decision-making power, basically. They're unconscious, basically. They're intubated. They're receiving breathing aid or something like that, basically. One member, essentially, of the old person-centered care team goes to the member of the family that has brought the patient in or has come in after they've been informed that an ambulance brought the patient in. They sit down with them and they use a structured interview format to guide their decision making. They say, okay, basically your mom basically is over there. She's 84 years old. Let's talk about her. Beyond clinical components, basically, we do have their medical history, basically. Tell me about who your mom is or was as a person. Tell me, basically, what was the best period in her life? When was your mom at her prime, right? And the daughter would say, you know what, she was at her prime about 15 years ago when her first grandchild was born, and she had just retired, and she was going hiking on a regular basis. Okay, the nurse would say. Now, let's think about what care decisions that version of your mom, 15 years ago mom, would make. Would she like to be fed through a tube? Would she like to be in an ICU bed, basically developing bed sores for a couple of weeks until she passes? Basically, would she like to be dependent? Like, no, my mom was always an extremely independent person. She never wanted to be a burden to anybody else. Basically, you're essentially guiding the member of the patient family to make the same care decision that the patient would make if they had their cognitive capabilities intact, essentially. This has become essentially the norm at Matter. They're training essentially ED staff to identify these patients on a number of markers and to notify the OPC team automatically, so they go down to the ED and they engage into those conversations. This is the admission criteria, right? The hard factors that tell you whether the patient is eligible or not. In that regard, this is the Queensland form that they use. This is a 27-page form. They have rescued the one page that makes sense, that is utilizable. You know, it's like the minus and the plus of living in Queensland and treating patients in Queensland at the same time, and the indicators. Essentially, as you can see here, basically a 40% decrease in the number of admissions. You can guarantee that most of those avoided admissions were not going to do any good to that patient. Essentially, for the patients that get admitted, even when they occupy an inpatient bed, the average length of stay has decreased by 2.5 days. Most of those patients are moved to hospice or to another sort of care facility that doesn't consume basically an inpatient bed. A 9% reduction in the number of representations. The last thing you want with these patients is for them to prompt basically the installation of a revolving door at the front of your ED, basically. And in the course of the first year in pilot mode, almost one care plan designed specifically for each individual patient created every single day, right? So lower resource utilization, adequate and appropriate care, basically significant increase in patient satisfaction, essentially, and in family satisfaction.
So the focus of this program is really on the end of life, older person at the end of life, as opposed to the complex older person who's, still got life, so to say. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the idea is, like, we know for a fact that 80% of healthcare expenditures occur during the last 5 years of any one person's life, right? We have to, I'm an economist, so you know what my bias is, my background, right? We have to figure out of that 80% essentially, how many of those dollars actually translate into a better outcome for the patient and which ones don't. And in view of the fact that decision making is better when made by the patient. Patients, for example, that understand the pros and cons of joint replacements usually tend to choose joint replacement far less often, about 1/3 of the time, when compared to patients on whom joint replacement is pushed, as the only alternative, right? So how do you make the patient's decision-making capabilities present, be in the room, even when that patient is not lucid, basically conscious and in the room? That's at the core of what this practice is.
It's interesting, there's a study done in Scotland and they looked at all the acute admissions for older people over 75 I think they had. 50% of those people will have died within the next year. So, as you say, the costs are quite high. The outcomes are interesting, and you need to rethink how you might manage that population. It's not just ignore them because they're going to die anyways, but you've got to still off. But yeah, you've got to rethink about what you're actually doing, in what you offer and how you offer it.
It's like, again, we have never seen a practice that didn't display, basically, that better informed patients choose better outcomes for themselves and to the system. The number of unnecessary surgeries that were essentially eliminated, cleared off the surgical schedule in Ottawa. The Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, essentially, is one of the best at creating what they call patient decision guides. It's a document that is written in patient-accessible language, devoid of any jargon, that says, okay, you have the following condition, essentially. These are the 3 most common forms of treatment for that condition, and these are the pros and the cons of every option. The choice is yours, essentially. And patients tend to pick alternatives that are far less invasive, that don't require a recovery time, which, quite frankly, most of them don't have, essentially. And it just so happens, this is never pushed on a cost savings language, because that would turn people off automatically. But it just so happens that they are the things that translate into the lower cost for the system overall. Right? So excessive care is far more common than undercare, at least in OECD countries. I know that we're close to the ending time. Essentially, there's a very comprehensive case study that comes from a hospital in the UK and an NHS organization. They used to be called Ipswich, and they recently changed their name to a completely unpronounceable acronym. I will continue to refer to them as Ipswich. The reason why we closed the study with the Ipswich example is that instead of taking tactical approaches that solve parts of the problem, and you notice that we ourselves divided the problem into 3 micro categories, right? Three columns. The Ipswich guys basically put in place a strategy that tackled every single aspect or angle of that sort of thing. Basically, 1, to give them centralized visibility, 1, to pull patients outside of beds, and 1, to avoid admissions altogether. The most impressive part of their strategy basically was their implementation of the red to green principle. You guys familiar with red days and green days? Basically, as launched by the NHS. Basically, that has been red to green has been a national mandate in the UK. Most hospitals are underutilizing the power of the resource. Ipswich is actually the exception, ahead of the curve in that regard. What they decided to do was to determine what was the appropriate amount of time that a patient should wait for something to happen. Essentially, we minimize the number of red days, we maximize the number of green days, but making sure that we know what is right in that regard. And that mandated the creation of professional standards, which you see here, right? Again, this is for an internal medicine ward. They have a few dozen of this, depending on where the patients are hospitalized, right? So they sit down in a room, not unlike this one, essentially. They look at patient files for the last 3 to 6 months. Essentially, they look at what they did right and what they did wrong, and they write a standard in terms of what is possible, right? And you see, essentially, this is, to take away medication, basically, the order has to be written 24 hours before the estimated date of discharge for that patient. Transport has to be arranged 48 hours before that date, and so on and so forth, right? There's no command and control center. There's no multi-million-dollar IT interface. There's no Luke Skywalker with the lightsaber at any point in time in here. They told us, we know that our standards are imperfect. The most important thing about a standard, it's not its perfection, but rather its existence altogether. We have something, essentially, to comply with, and we'll modify the standards down the line if we realize that we have been too self-complacent in that regard. But now, every time a patient is admitted, essentially, there's a very clear music sheet that tells us which notes we need to hit as we sing that particular song in that regard. Again, they've done a couple of other things. They've centralized their patient flow around the ED. The red to green principle actually has been turbocharged with a couple of additional things. Every time a ward or a unit essentially has a length of stay that is higher on average than what the patient population staying in that unit would justify, every time they're deviating from the professional standard, basically, they get a team of twins from another unit to come and do roundings together. So you would have basically a doctor and a nurse from geriatrics coming to internal medicine, and they're rounding together with their twins in internal medicine to try to figure out why basically they're not moving those patients forwards, why they have so many red and not enough green days in that regard. And they do audit the performance. Are you sure that the amount of time this patient spent waiting for his MRI was the minimum amount of time necessary? Or did you add some fat into that particular mechanism? They did a stepped or staged approach, basically, trying to move patients out of inpatient beds. Basically, ex ante, patients on antibiotic courses basically spend 22 days hospitalized, right? And then they moved them to an outpatient clinic, and they used the time in the outpatient clinic, the ambulatory stage, basically to train the patients on self-administration of antibiotics, and those patients do it at home. This is the centralization of their complex and multimorbid patients. But again, what I wanted to jump to was, again, the results. By virtue of putting all of these things in place within the context of resource scarcity and constant cost reduction, that is the NHS, they have hit every single mark, right? They're being held out as an example of what other trusts should do in England.
What would happen if you said, we have a tendency to, if you closed 30% of the beds in Victoria, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, how would that change? Would health services and would this happen? How much of this lag is related to the fact that we're sort of dependent on beds, and there's always this constant argument that we need more beds, we can build a bigger emergency department so we can attract more people to them, and we sort of generate this activity. Whether you turn it on their face, I've often thought, well, if you turn it around and then make sure that you obviously funded alternatives, if you could drive much of this activity, these are great ideas.
Yeah. So I don't have an answer at the scale level that you propose. I wouldn't dream of thinking of something like that for Victoria, given its current size. Every single smaller scale experiment that we have seen in that regard has yielded positive results, right? So we have a couple of examples here in Australia. We're still profiling those cases, so unfortunately I cannot tell you who they are. We require basically explicit authorization on the part of the hospital before we actually publish their cases. We have a couple in Australia. We have one more in Ontario. We have one Finnish hospital that is trying something like this. Every single time they have shut down units and redeployed the personnel, the staff, essentially, they had in those units to community-based settings, their clinical and their financial indicators have improved, right? So one of the Australian examples that they're monitoring right now, essentially, was a 21-bed unit, essentially, that was closed down. The team, essentially, incur more fuel costs now because they're driving around seeing patients in the community. They are seeing, on average, 63 patients a day, right? So they have tripled the capacity of that team, which remains exactly the same. They haven't added or taken away a single FTE, basically. The same team, the same human resource, is covering 3 times as many patients as they did when they had one physical environment by which they were, obviously, based on the results, not empowered but constrained.
We've got I don't know, it's one one of these examples. We have Victorian Hospital that's, due to its frustrations about the infrastructure that it has closed down a whole ward, 2 wards actually, and redirected all that care into community-based settings. So this isn't a subacute sort of space, it's about rehabilitation. But yeah, it's driven them, I suppose. They were already on that path anyway, but they've escalated what was a small thing into a large thing, and it's allowed them to reduce their dependence on beds, but it also changes the whole model. So the whole way of thinking about how you address someone, say, following a stroke, or someone following an injury, or someone who's frail and elderly, you redistribute that into the community, and so it's it makes you think. Yes, as long as you've got the resources, and you have, I'm not saying just close 30% of the beds right now, but yeah, you have to make sure that those resources are sitting there so that you can do things in a more clever way, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And not surprisingly, more people prefer it because more people want to be at home rather than what was an older style hospital with 5 or 6 people in a room with 1 bathroom. Nobody really particularly wants to live like that. So, they want to be home if they can.
So I can argue against the opposite hypothesis. Essentially, we have never seen in 40 years of research, we have never seen a problem solved by increasing physical capacity. Like, we have members in the US that would double their physical capacity, right, and still be overwhelmed and operate above 85% occupancy, which is supposed to be the maximum sustainable occupancy rate within weeks. We have one member in Virginia that actually doubled its emergency department capacity. 2 weeks later, they were detouring ambulances away from it, right? So let's assume for a second that financial resource constraints cease to exist, right? That you go into the parking lot of the nearest hospital, you dig a hole in the ground and you find a treasure chest, right? And the diamonds in there can allow you to fund basically doubling the size of the hospital. It will be exceeded in its capabilities within weeks or months, right? Moreover, basically, you double the size of your hospital, how are you going to staff it? Basically, it's going to take you a while. We actually build what we call the virtual capacity model that shows you how the opposite alternative is significantly better. Every time you decrease length of stay, you create virtual beds, essentially, and they are a fraction of the cost of physical beds that you have to build in that regard. I would say if you want to take a look at an example that has continued delivering results, it's a gift that keeps on giving. The indicators continue basically improving over time. It will be Vancouver General Hospital, part of Vancouver Coastal Health in British Columbia, Canada. The kink of that practice is that the story begins in the ED. They continue to rely on their emergency department as the place where they detect patients that should be cared for in an ambulatory setting. So kind of like, the origin of the solution exists at the core of the problem, which is ED over reliance, right? It's somewhat counterintuitive. But we talk to the Vancouver General guys once every 3 to 6 months. And they say, oh, remember how we told you that ever since we implemented this, average length of stay had decreased by 25%? You have to update your slides. Now it's 28.5%. And then we call them 3 months later. It's like, oh yeah, now average length of stay has decreased by 32% now, and so on and so forth. This is one best practice that can essentially keep improving on top of their previous improvement. It was profiled in the Emergency Care Strategy Guide, which we published in early 2015. It was our 2014 research cycle, if you're interested. So with that, essentially,
virtual capacity model something.
if you go to the website and type on the search box, basically, discharge opportunity calculator, essentially it gives you the model, and you say, for example, okay, my hospital has 300 beds, essentially, and my goal is to reduce average length of stay by 1 day. You plug in that data. You hit basically on the execute button, basically, and it will tell you how many virtual beds that generates. And then if you scroll down the page, you can do the opposite numerical calculation. I have this new surgical line, and they want to perform 15 heart transplants a week, which means I'm going to need 15 extra beds a week. Basically, by how much do I need to decrease my average length of stay to guarantee that post-surgical capacity in the hospital? Right. So you plug in your own data, essentially, and it gives you, what to aim for.
I was just a bit of a back of an envelope calculation, but I was looking at average length of stay in Victoria for a person who's over 85 is 2.5 days longer than someone who's over 65, which is about 2 days longer than someone who might be 35 or 40. But anyway, even if you reduced the older 85-year-old back to this over 65-year-old length of stay, you free up 500 beds in Victoria, which is basically a hospital.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of, the impact, and 2.5 days potentially isn't that great a deal, because you'll find within those episodes of care probably is an enormous amount of wastage time. No value, people waiting for something, not discharge to assess, but assess to discharge. So there's a whole lot of stuff you could do. But the impact can be quite.
Can I use that staff into guidelines?
I'll redo it because it was in the back of an envelope.
Please redo it and send it to me.
Yeah, but it just shows the
We'll put it in our
impact.
compelling case.
Compelling case.
Yeah.
That is all I have in terms of content. I want to thank you, essentially, for jumping in with both feet. With your questions and your comments, you have moved the conversation forward. I really appreciate that. Again, as I told Marie earlier in the day, we have covered 14 months worth of research in 3 hours. If you feel that I've thrown the library at you, that only means that you're normal human beings. Don't worry about that. Basically, there's plenty more where this came from. We are currently helping a few dozen hospitals basically jump into implementation. So as the dust settles, essentially, if you decide what it is that you want to do, which of the tactics that we've discussed basically hits the sweet spot in terms of their impact and their feasibility. But particularly important the feasibility, because you know which resources you have and which ones you don't, far better than I ever will. You're Victoria experts and I'm not, obviously. Please let us know. Okay, we don't want you to feel that you have to go it alone once you decide what you want to implement. If there's anything that you can anticipate you will need help with, please use your evaluation forms to let us know. I'll make sure essentially that both Ben in the Sydney office and the research team in the Washington DC office basically know how to follow up, what to send you, when to schedule a catch-up conversation, and so on and so forth.
So I might just say, for those online, if you've got your evaluation forms, I did send them to rural managers. If you can have a think about what it is that you want to follow up, and also what other sorts of presentations you'd be interested in, and email them back to me, Marie Roberts, and then I'll pass them on to the advisory board and we'll keep talking.
Thank you.